Well, when the night is long, when the dark is strong, and when you can't go on, you need Jesus. Right? That's just the truth. Yeah. I want you to think about that. We look around at the news, and I see cities burning. I see courthouses under siege, and I wonder whether or not people have just lost their ever-loving minds. You think about that? You see things like that? I talk to friends I know, and I see diagnoses of diseases that I don't like. I see the prevalence of cancer, and I wonder, what are we going to do in the face of that? And I look at the news, and I tend to get uptight, and I tend to let the news stories, if I spend too much time on them, which I am very careful not to do these days, but if I end up watching the news for hours on end, it's not too long before my anxieties begin to creep up, and my eyes suddenly realize that my eyes are not on Jesus. And this world can do that to us pretty easily. It can take our eyes off of Jesus. In fact, there's some things that we go through on a daily basis that can easily take our eyes off of Jesus. And I would just recite to you again that little verse. I scribed it this week. When the night is long and the dark is strong, when you can't go on, you need Jesus. Because that's the truth. And it's the truth for what is occurring to the church. It's represented in the book of Revelation as that church is is on the very cusp of entirely losing. When we get to chapter 14 and we get, if you will, a breath of fresh air, a break, a revelation, we get to see Jesus. And it changes the perspective of everything that's going on. And it's necessary because the church that would have first received this was already in the midst of persecution. They were not able to, like we are today, sit in a comfortably air-conditioned sanctuary, free from any fear of external involvement, and able to talk about the potential of persecution in some kind of an academic sense. They were living it. They were huddling in rooms and trying not to get caught by Roman soldiers. They were enduring persecution already. Their families had already excommunicated them or kicked them out of the families. Their synagogues had released them from fellowship. They had already begun to lose their jobs and their capacity to feed themselves. And for them to read that things were about to get worse would have been, can I just say, discouraging? I'd ask for a show of hands. Have any of you ever been discouraged? But I'm afraid we'd all just be waving our hands around, because discouragement seems to be what happens in life. But in the midst of all of that discouragement, we have got to see Jesus, and that's where chapter 14 brings us. The book of Revelation is often understood simply to be a window on the future. And I think that the book of Revelation is a foretelling of things yet to come in all kinds of symbolism and stuff like that. But it is also meant to be a very present reality for us as the church, to be able to look around and to recognize that in the midst of all of the struggles that we may find ourselves in on our daily basis, whether it's persecution from external sources or whether it's just battling our own problems, we need to see Jesus. And that's the problem that is faced by the prophet Amos. In his day, Amos, as in ours, it seemed people were eager for the judgment of God to come because they wanted to see their enemies judged, but they didn't realize that they themselves will also fall in that judgment. And so Amos writes to them in Amos chapter 5, and I didn't put it up there, I apologize. So in Amos chapter 5, he says, why are you guys, in verses 18 through 20, he says, why are you guys so utterly eager to experience the day of the Lord? The day of the Lord is going to be darkness and not light. It's not very encouraging words. He wants them to understand that tough things are going to come. So I want you to stand with me, if you would, and I want you to read together. You'll probably need your Bibles because the text is a little small on the screen. But stand with me, if you would, and we'll get into Revelation chapter 14, verses 1 through 5. Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of thunder. And the voice which I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth. These are the ones who have not been defiled with women, for they have kept themselves chaste. They are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been purchased from among men as firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. And no lie was found in their mouth. They are blameless. Amen. Well, you can be seated. Thank you. I'd love to read some more, but that would involve me stepping further and further away from the text that we're supposed to be in. The first thing we see as we open up Revelation chapter 14 is the Lamb on Mount Zion. And there's very good reason for that, and it takes my favorite word, and that is context, to understand why this verse is coming at us right now. And so we would almost have to, in fact, I'm going to ask you just to roll your eyes uphill just a little bit to chapter 13 and look at the very end of it, as everything is in absolute chaos, as people are receiving the mark of the beast, as the Antichrist had an image now made of him, and the false prophet has caused that image to speak, and it is the command that everybody who wants to, must worship the image of the beast. Does that sound at all like King Nebuchadnezzar's image on the plain, by the way? That anybody must worship that image, and if they don't, they'll be put to death. And then if you want to be able to buy cereal for your kids for breakfast, you have to take the mark of the beast. And you see all of this chaos unraveling, and then the scene changes. And John shows us, then I saw the Lamb standing on Mount Zion with the 144,000, and they are marked with the mark of the Father and the mark of the Son. So I want us to look at that. We need to keep that context in our minds, and just remembering where we're at in the flow of Revelation. Back in Revelation chapter 8, verse 13, 3 woes are pronounced upon the earth. And then rapidly we see the fifth trumpet. Don't have time to get into it right now. You've got these locusts, and that's described as the first woe, which means there's 2 more to come. And then you have the death and the resurrection of the 2 witnesses and the subsequent earthquake, and that's the second woe that is described for us in Revelation chapter 11. And the third begins with Satan's assault on earth against Israel and ultimately the church in Revelation 12:12, but goes all the way through with the revelation of Satan called the dragon, and then you have the first beast recognized as the Antichrist, the second beast, who we've named him the false prophet, and we'll see where that name comes from later on in the book. And you have this outpouring of immense persecution against the church that, according to Daniel 7:21, looks like the church is utterly going to lose. In fact, we all remember the words because I keep bringing them to our attention, where Jesus says, look, if those days had not been cut short, nobody would be saved. Nobody would last. Nobody would survive. And so we have this story that's been going on, and in the midst of all of that chaos with the war of the saints, it looks like the church is losing, because the church is losing. And that's when John shows us what we need to see, and that's Jesus. The Lamb is there, and he is on the... there was Amos. I had it out of order. I'm sorry. We see the Lamb, and he's standing on Mount Zion. Let's look at the Lamb real quickly. We saw him at the very beginning in chapter 5 of Revelation. We saw him John saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, bringing us to remember that Jesus had died for us. We celebrate communion. We remember that Jesus died, and his body is represented by the brokenness of the bread, and that his blood poured out for us. His life source is recognized as the cup of juice. John looks and he sees Jesus, this lamb, looking as if it had been slain for us, and he's standing on Mount Zion. Now, Mount Zion is typically understood to be Jerusalem, but then there's some ambiguity. Surprise, the book of Revelation has some ambiguity in it. There's some ambiguity as the book of Revelation describing, is that Mount Zion, is this in Jerusalem on earth? Or is this the heavenly Jerusalem? And the ambiguity remains there, but there might be a little bit of help by looking at the Old Testament. Surprise, surprise. When you see Zion named in the prophets, there's 3 names that are frequently used of Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem is sometimes called Jerusalem or the city of David, but when it's called Jerusalem, it's usually being highlighted, and not 100% of the time, but usually being highlighted about the sin that's taking place there. Then when you see the name Zion that is listed in the Old Testament, it is usually, not 100% of the time, and so there's, like I said, some ambiguity here. When you see Zion, it is usually basing the promises that God has given to the city of Jerusalem on earth. And then when you see the term Mount Zion, about 19 times in the Old Testament, when you see the term Mount Zion, 9 out of those 19 times, so hardly less than ambiguous, but 9 of those 19 times, it is specifically referring to the eternal kingdom of the Messiah. And so I lean towards looking at this as the eternal kingdom of the Messiah being represented. But I want to leave room for that. Remember, when we started this whole study of Revelation, I still hold that same principle. This is one of those things you should hold in an open hand and just recognize that we need to be generous with people who think differently as we come to this text. And so there's room for that. But you can't miss the imagery. You can't miss the importance of the imagery. Here is the Lamb, Jesus, standing in the midst of his kingdom. Does it matter whether it's in heaven or on earth at this point? I don't think that it does. We just need to see Jesus and recognize his victory, especially in the midst of all of this loss. In fact, John invites us to see the Lamb. It's intriguing. He says, and then I saw the Lamb, and behold the Lamb. He wants you to behold. He wants you to look. In fact, anytime you see that word behold in the Bible, I've said what? It's the Southerner equivalent of, hey, y'all, look at this. We are meant to see Jesus standing on Mount Zion, referring to the fulfillment of his kingdom. And in fact, we are invited to see Jesus utterly victorious. I would like you to put your finger or your bulletin or your pen or something here in Revelation and go back to Psalm chapter 2. Psalms are always easy, right? They're right in the middle of the Bible. So go back to Psalms chapter 2. And as my fingers try to do the walking, I'm trying to get there. Trying to get there before you do, but I don't know if I will. Chapter 2, verse 6 in particular is what I'm looking at, but it starts in the first couple of verses, why are all the nations raging? Why are the people causing all this problem? They're doing so in vain. There's just like this rebellion against God that doesn't make any sense. They're devising vain things. The kings of the earth taking their stand, saying, let's not have anything to do with God and his king. We want nothing to do with him. And then verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs and scoffs at them. God has a sense of humor, it seems, derisive humor, as he looks at these guys who are attempting to throw off God's shackles, as if you can somehow divorce yourself from the one who owns the entire universe. But then he says in verse 6, as for me, God speaking, as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And we are meant to see that this is God's answer to the utter chaos of the people's devising a vain thing, the utter chaos of Satan, of the Antichrist, and of the false prophet, and of all the people of the earth setting themselves up against the church, and of this massive wave of persecution that is being described in the book of Revelation, and this massive wave of persecution that is happening today to our brothers and sisters all over the globe this morning who are hiding in little rooms, who are literally worshiping in underground bunkers, who are hiding in burned out hovels, who are staying away as much as possible from public eye, from Chinese brothers and sisters who are in apartment buildings up on the 19th floor with 3 or 4 people in the room, singing without making any noise, only moving their lips to the hymns that they sing, quoting the scriptures that they've memorized because they don't have access to one, because they know that if any moment a soldier were to come knock on that door, they would all be arrested, their families would be arrested, and most of them would be put to death. In the midst of that kind of chaos, you need Jesus. And we need to be reminded that Jesus is going to win this thing. Right? And we also see this mysterious group of the 144,000. Oh man, interpreted in so many ways. But back, we saw them in Revelation chapter 7 rather. We saw the 144,000 for the first time, and we identified them. I identified them as representative of the entire church. You've got the 12 apostles. You've got the 12 founders of Israel, if you will, the 12 tribes of Israel, times 1,000. So you've got this fullness represented, this fullness of all of those who have ever followed after God in obedience. So you've got this fullness of the entire church throughout all of the ages, marked by God, representing his ownership and his protection. And I want you to notice this mark. The name of the Lamb and the name of his father are written on their foreheads. Now remember, looking at the mark of the beast in the former chapter, you could take the mark of the beast and you could write it on their left hand, right? There's a left hand, right hand. You could write it on their right hand, or you could put it on their forehead, and it kind of symbolizes this idea that the beast, this declaration of obedience to the beast, is either something that they truly believe in, written on their forehead, or it's just represented by the activities of their life. They don't even have to believe it as long as they just obey it. But that's not the case with the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast is truly something that we believe in. These are marked as true believers. Their allegiance to God is not a merely external obedience. I know that's not the case for any of us. That the Lord would ever look at us and he would say that you're just obeying me externally without any kind of true heart for me. These guys are standing with Jesus, and the church needs to see themselves standing victoriously with Jesus. Moreover, if you remember the text of Ezekiel chapter 9, and I've referenced that several times, so Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, once again, you see that note being marked as the possession of God was a mark of protection. Remember, in Ezekiel, a couple of destroying angels come along, and their job is to go through Jerusalem and kill all the sinners. And this is in the vision that Ezekiel is seeing. And in Ezekiel's vision, as God is getting ready to give directions for these destroying angels, he turns and he looks. He sees an angel with a writing kit at his side. And he says, I want you to go through Jerusalem, Mr. Writing Kit Angel, and I want you to put a mark on the forehead of all of those who mourn the sin of Israel. I want you to put a mark on all of the repentant. In other words, all of the believers. I want you to put a mark on them. And then after he dismisses that angel, he turns to the destroying angels in Ezekiel's vision, and God says to the destroying angels, okay, now that his job is done, you go through Jerusalem and kill everybody who isn't marked as belonging to me. And of course, Ezekiel responds, God, nobody's going to survive this. And the story goes on. Read Ezekiel. It'll be enriching, I assure you. But here you have this image of what God's protection means as God's judgment is about to fall on all of the earth. And that's really what we see the beginning of the foreshadowing of in chapter 14 as we get to the end of this little mini-series within Revelation, this brief history of time, culminating in the fact that God is going to judge the earth, but he's going to protect his people. And then John hears a voice. We hear the worship of the redeemed. He hears this voice that's coming from heaven, which leads me a little bit towards leaning on understanding that this declaration of Mount Zion is the heavenly kingdom, if you will. But this voice is coming from heaven. It's a unified voice of many, many, many voices coming together. And in fact, he's got all kinds of language of likeness. The music, the sound, it was like the roar of many waters. Anybody ever been to the ocean and heard the oceans breaking against the rock? It's loud. It's actually quite loud. Especially, I remember being up in the Pacific Northwest with my parents when I was just a young warthog, and experiencing these waves. They rolled all the way across the Pacific Ocean, and they hit these rocks, and they just explode with tremendous force. And it was so loud I couldn't hear my parents talking. I refuse to confess that I liked it. Anyhow, they could say the same thing. I couldn't hear my son talking, and it was wonderful. I'm sure. I'm cutting that before I put that on YouTube. I'm just going to let you know. Just maybe. Either that or I'll get a phone call from my mom. What did you mean? He describes this water this like really, really, really loud, like ocean. Then he describes it like harps. It's actually musical. It's not just loud and raucous, it's musical. It's the voices, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people uniting together. It used to be one of the high points for me when I would go to the Moody Pastors Conference every year, the Moody Bible Institute Pastors Conference. And I'd get in this, the auditorium there, Torrey Gray Auditorium, and sit in the red velvet chairs, and we would be listening to some of the great speakers. I can remember listening to great sermons by the Reverend E.V. Hill and many, many others who had gone now to be in the presence of the Lord. And the sermons were always tremendous. They were usually tremendous, but the worship was always astounding. As thousands of men would begin to sing songs that they knew very well, and they would sing them with all of the gusto that they could muster, almost as if you were trying to be louder than the guy next to you and just as musical. And it was tremendous. as it would echo through Torrey Gray Auditorium. I miss the fact that the Moody Pastors Conferences are now done, and I won't be doing them anymore, but those were glorious moments of worshiping together. As a matter of fact, when we shut down services earlier in the year and we went 2 months without being together, and I know some churches are still not together, one of the things I missed the most was the corporate singing. Fame has this great history of wonderful singing. And whether the crowd is large or whether the crowd is small, somehow we manage to have quite wonderful worship together. I enjoy it so much. There's something glorious about that worship. But these redeemed are coming together to sing a new song. Interesting that it's described as a new song, and sometimes we use that as saying we need to stop singing the old stuff and start singing the new stuff. That's a misappropriation of the text, but this is a new song, and it's a new song because of its content. Because this is something new that has happened upon the earth. Now, obviously, anybody can learn a song. Anybody can learn a song. It doesn't mean they can sing it or they can sing it well, but anybody can learn a song. I mean, if you listen to it enough times, it's not long before the lyrics get stuck in. It doesn't matter what the song is. It doesn't have to be a hymn. It doesn't have to be heavy metal. It could be, I don't like rap music, but it could be rap music. It could be any of those things, country music. It's not long before you can start learning the words of the song. So what's meant by the fact that only the 144,000 could learn it? It doesn't mean that everybody else was somehow mentally deficient and couldn't pick up on the language. It's just that this was a song that was really only capable of being sung, celebrating, I think, my redemption. And this is a song that only the redeemed can sing. This is a song that the redeemed can sing is celebrating the redemption that Christ has given to them individually and corporately as we come together, this new song. And so it's this idea that we'll be able to celebrate together. Those that have been purchased. Interesting phrase, from the earth. And it's the same kind of language that's used by St. Paul. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, chapter 6, verse 20, and chapter 7, verse 23, he says, you've been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. And later he says, you've been bought with a price. Don't become slaves of men. In other words, you need to recognize the fact that you, dear Christian, you do not belong to yourself. You have been bought and paid for by God. You are His possession. You are His, and He owns you. Man, that's a wonderful image, I think, especially when we understand that being owned by God means that we fall underneath all of His blessings. Those who are marked by God will also worship Him. Furthermore, they're described a little bit in verses 4 and 5 as we come to the end of the section, and it's kind of a strange description, perhaps. And I'm just going to tell you exactly what I believe it means as I talk about them. They are the army of God. They are the redeemed that serve as God's army. Very intriguingly, verses 4 and 5. Weird. They're described as these are the ones that have not been defiled with women. They've kept themselves chaste. They're virgins. They're the ones who follow the Lamb wherever He goes. These have been purchased from among men. They're first fruits to God and to the Lamb, and they don't lie. It's a strange grouping of descriptions, interestingly enough. Very intriguingly, first thing they're described as undefiled and chaste. And the problem I have when I look at this is that throughout church history, unfortunately, this has been interpreted variously in ways of saying essentially that sex bad. Even in marriage, sex is bad. That's been interpreted that way, unfortunately, by the Catholic Church. It's only for procreation. It's not for enjoyment. I don't know. If you've never read the Song of Solomon, you really are missing out on something. Can I just be blunt and say that there's a reason why God created sex, and it's for marital pleasure? So to say that this is the thing that makes them super saints is that somehow they've ignored the good gift of God entirely. That seems to blow in the face of good theology. So I wonder if the Old Testament has anything to say about clarity. You know it does. Bringing some clarity to the passage, you know that it absolutely does. In the book of 1 Samuel chapter 21, as King David is running away from Saul again, as King Saul is trying to kill he's not King David yet. as the gonna-be King David is running away from the current King Saul because King Saul's trying to kill him again. He is hightailing it out of there. Jonathan has just confessed to him that, yes, my dad is trying to kill you. And David gets up and he flees for his life. And as he's running away, he stops at the tabernacle, or the temple, because that's what you would do. If you're a man of God, you're going to seek God. And he goes to the tabernacle and he goes to the priest and he says, have you got a sword? Well, I got Goliath's sword. You can have this. And he says, well, do you have any food? And the priest kind of looks at him and he goes, the only food I got is the bread of the presence. Now, if you don't remember, the bread of the presence every single day, we're going to talk about this tonight in our study of Leviticus, hint, hint. But the bread of the presence every single day was prepared and was brought into the holy place and was laid out upon this table before the candelabra that was always shining. We'll talk about that tonight. And on that table, that fresh bread would be laid, 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And then, at the exchange of the day, fresh bread would be brought in. The bread that had been sitting there all day would be brought out, and that was given to the priests to be consumed because it was brought into the holy place as a holy offering to the Lord. Well, there's the background. King David, not yet King David, says, you got any food? And Abiathar, I think it's Abiathar the priest, he says, well, I don't have anything except for the showbread. Then he says, I tell you what, if your men are pure, I'll give you this. And he's referring not to sinlessness, he's referring to a ritual purity that enables a man to live and to serve before God. That's represented so much in the book of Leviticus that we've been talking about on Sunday nights, and we're almost done. But the description there that David responds with tells us something. In fact, if I could just point out that David and the men that had gathered around him as warriors, they're described at the end of Samuel's books as the mighty men of valor. There's 37 of them, and these guys perform some of the most amazing feats of bravery and valor. These are men's men. These are warriors. These are the kind of guys that you want gathered around them, and they're married. And I only point that particular point out, that many of them are married, simply to recite what David says in his response in 1 Samuel 21:5. Surely, he says, women have been kept from us as previously when I set out. The vessels of the young men are holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? In other words, they've been refraining from intercourse with their wives as a way of setting themselves apart to be servants of the Lord in battle. That's what's being referred to here in the book of Revelation. They have been set apart as servants of the Lord in battle. This is what the church is described as. Those who are set apart as servants to the Lord in battle. We are the warriors of Christ. That's how the church is described. All of the statements that follow, they're honest to the core. They're not telling lies. There's no guile in them. There's no deception in them. They're honest people. All of those descriptions goes to say that they are wholly dedicated to the Lord. Church, are you wholly dedicated to the Lord? And if not, if you sit there and you think, I'm not entirely certain that I would say that in the past week, my life has been wholly dedicated to the Lord. Can I say that this is the moment to rededicate and to say that I'm going to now be, in the week ahead, wholly dedicated to the Lord? Can I say that this is one of the purposes for the church to come together to church every week, is so that we might reassess and reevaluate and recharge and recommit to being wholly set apart for the Lord? The language here is, if you will, militaristic. It sets into our mind that the final battle is yet to come. It's in chapter 19. The church will, at the ultimate end of all things, follow Christ into that final battle, and Christ will gain the victory. There's no indication, by the way, and I find this abundantly intriguing. I find it encouraging that it looks like the church follows Christ into battle at the very end, but never lifts our own swords, because Jesus does it all. You know what? That's how salvation works. We follow after him, and he does it all. The imagery here is vital for the church, especially a church at struggle, to see. The image here is vital for a church like us. Because right now, it looks like evil is winning all over the world. And in the last days, certainly, it will look like evil is completely... In fact, it will look like the devil has won. The Antichrist will look triumphant. But we need to know, dear church, that that's only the valley of the shadow of death, and we shall fear no evil, for he is with us. When the night is long, when the dark is strong, when you can't go on, you need Jesus.